Garnett, Colorado Territory, the 9th of November, 1883. The water was a liar. All through September it had lain calm and clear in the creek beds, docile as a house cat, promising nothing but easy passage and gentle thaw. But water in the high country keeps its own calendar, and by the first week of November it had already begun its slow betrayal, freezing in the joints of pipes, cracking the mortar between stones, and pooling in places where it had no business being. For Marandal, the water had already taken everything it could carry. Her husband, Peter, had drowned in 17 inches of it, not in a river or a lake, but in the flooded cellar of the old London Assay Office, where he had been hired to assess the structural damage after the autumn rains. The beam gave way. The water rushed in, 17 inches. A man can drown in less. The coroner called it a tragedy. The town clerk called it a liability. And Gerald Croft, the bank agent who held the deed to the cottage Peter had been buying on contract, called it an opportunity to settle accounts. He came on a Tuesday. Maren remembered because she had been boiling Peter's work shirts, a habit she could not yet break, and the steam had fogged the single window, so that Croft appeared as a dark shape first, a silhouette that knocked 3 times with the bone of his knuckle. He was a thin man, with clean fingernails and a voice like a door closing. "Mrs. Dahl, the contract was in your husband's name. The payments are 60 days past due. I have filed the notice of forfeiture with the county." He held out the paper. She did not take it, so he set it on the porch rail, weighting it with a stone, as though it were a napkin at a picnic. "There is a boarding house in Silver Plume that takes women," he added. He said it the way a man offers a glass of water to someone whose house is burning. "Silver Plume is 40 miles, Maren said. "Yes." He looked past her, at the fogged window, at the steam. "I am sorry about Peter. He was a competent man." That was the word he chose. Competent. Not good or kind or missed, competent. As though Peter had been a tool that performed adequately before it broke. Croft turned and walked back down the path, and Maren watched him go and noticed that he paused at the gate just for a moment and adjusted the latch so it closed properly behind him. It was a small, strange gesture, almost tender, and it made her hate him more than the eviction itself. By Thursday she was out. 2 men from the bank came with a mule cart and loaded her things while she stood in the yard holding a canvas sack that contained Peter's journal, his drafting tools, and a brass compass that had belonged to his father in the old country. The men were not rough. They stacked her crates neatly in the dirt beside the road, and one of them, a young fellow with a sunburn that never seemed to heal, said he was sorry and appeared to mean it. The town of Garnett watched from its porches and its windows. They watched the way people watch a funeral procession for someone they did not know well, with a solemn curiosity that costs nothing. Maren was an outsider twice over. She was a widow in a territory that measured women by the men who stood beside them. And she was a Dane, the daughter of a Copenhagen ceramicist who had come to America with clay dust under his fingernails and a head full of kilns and glazes that no one in Colorado had any use for. Her English still carried the rounded vowels of her father's workshop, and when she was tired or frightened, Danish crept back into her sentences like a cat returning to a house it had been chased from. Pity was a brief visitor in Garnett. It arrived with the news of Peter's death and departed within the week, chased away by the more urgent business of preparing for winter. Every household had its own calculations to make, cords of wood to stack, joints to seal, root cellars to fill. A lone foreign woman with no income and no claim was not a cause. She was an arithmetic problem that the town had solved by subtraction. But Maren carried something the town could not subtract. She carried Peter's journal, and Peter Dahl had not been merely competent. He had been brilliant in the quiet, undramatic way of men who think with their hands. He was a structural assessor by trade, but by nature he was an engineer of the invisible. He studied how water moved through soil, how heat traveled through stone, how the earth itself breathed. He had grown up in the salt mines of Jutland, where his father and grandfather had spent their lives underground. And he understood something that the men of Garnet, with their timber frame cabins and their cast iron stoves, did not. "The surface is a fool, Merrin," he had told her once, sitting at their small table, sketching cross-sections of foundations by lamplight. His pencil moved with the confidence of a man drawing a map of a place he had visited many times. It freezes and thaws and cracks because it is exposed. But go down 6 feet, 8 feet, and the temperature does not change. The earth keeps its own counsel. It does not panic when winter comes. She had not understood then. She was a ceramicist's daughter, not an engineer. But she had listened. The way she had listened to her father explain the behavior of clay in a kiln, and the knowledge had settled into her like sediment, waiting. Now, standing beside a pile of crates on a dirt road in early November with 40 miles of mountain between her and the nearest boarding house, she opened Peter's journal and turned to a page she had read before but never truly seen. It was a sketch of the old Lundgren assay office, the building where he died. He had drawn it in cross-section, the stone walls, the timber supports, the cellar below. And beside the sketch, in his small, precise hand, he had written a series of notes about the water that pooled in the cellar. Spring-fed, constant temperature 54 degrees F. Even in January, geothermal influence from the old mine shaft below. This cellar is warmer than any cabin in town. The Lundgren family does not know what they are sitting on. Maren stared at the page. She stared at it until the ink blurred and she realized she was crying, not from grief but from something sharper and more dangerous. Recognition. The building that had killed her husband was the only shelter that might save her life. The Lundgren assay office sat at the eastern edge of Garnet, where the town gave way to scrub oak and mine tailings. It had been abandoned for 3 years, ever since the silver veins played out and old Elias Lundgren packed his scales and moved to Denver. The roof had partially collapsed. The ground floor was a ruin of broken glass and warped timber. But the cellar, the stone-walled cellar that stayed flooded through every season, was intact. It was also the place no one wanted. Maren went there on her first afternoon of homelessness. She stood at the top of the cellar stairs and looked down into the dark water. It was nearly 2 feet deep, murky with sediment, and it smelled of minerals and wet limestone, a smell like the inside of a cave. The water was absurdly, impossibly warm against her fingers when she knelt and tested it. 54 degrees in a world where the air above was already dropping below freezing at night. The spring fed it from below, up through a fissure in the old mine shaft, and the earth held the temperature steady, the way a mother holds a sleeping child. Constant, patient. Indifferent to the tantrums of the surface, she moved her things into the standing portion of the ground floor that same evening. It was miserable. Wind came through the gaps in the walls. The floor was rotten, but she was not interested in the ground floor. She was interested in what lay beneath it. Over the next 2 weeks, Maren Dahl went to war with water. She worked from Peter's journal like a hymnal, following his sketches and calculations with the faith of a woman who had nothing else to believe in. The first task was to lower the water level in the cellar. She could not drain it entirely, the spring would not permit that, but she could channel it. Using the small drafting compass and a length of twine, she mapped the cellar floor, identifying the point where the spring entered and the natural gradient of the stone. Then, with a pickaxe that had been Peter's and a determination that was entirely her own, she cut a narrow trench along the eastern wall, directing the overflow out through the old foundation and into the drainage ditch beyond. It took 4 days. Her hands blistered, broke, and blistered again. The skin between her fingers cracked and bled into the water, small red threads that dissolved and vanished. By the end of the 4th day, the water level had dropped to 8 inches, contained mostly in the western half of the cellar where the spring bubbled up through the rock. The eastern half was damp stone, slick but exposed. She could work with that. The next phase was the one that would have made her father weep with recognition. She built a floor, not a wooden floor which would rot in the dampness, but a floor of stone and clay. She hauled flat creek stones from the gulch, hundreds of them, carrying them in a canvas sling until her shoulders burned and the muscles in her lower back felt like heated wire. She laid them tight across the eastern cellar floor, fitting them together the way her father had fitted tiles in his workshop in Copenhagen, tapping each one into place with a wooden mallet, listening for the sound that meant it was seated. Then she mixed clay from the creek bank with straw and gravel and packed it into the joints, sealing the floor into a single continuous surface. A ceramicist's daughter knows clay. She knows when it is too wet, too dry, when it will crack and when it will hold. This was not art. It was survival dressed in the language of craft. The clay floor served a purpose that went beyond keeping her feet dry. It was thermal mass. Peter had explained the principle in his journal, though he used the Danish word varmekapacitet, which Maren translated as heat memory. Dense materials, stone, clay, earth, and water, absorb heat slowly and release it slowly. The spring water at 54 degrees was constantly warming the stone beneath the floor. The stone held that warmth and radiated it upward. The cellar was not heated in any way the men of Garnet would recognize. There was no fire, no stove, no visible source. But the floor was warm to the touch, and the air 6 inches above it was warmer than the air in any cabin in town. She built walls next, not to keep the cold out, but to keep the warmth in. She framed a small room in the eastern cellar, 8 feet by 10, using salvaged timber from the collapsed roof. Between the studs, she packed a mixture of straw, clay, and sawdust, a cob wall nearly 14 inches thick. The wall did not fight the cold, it simply ignored it, the way a boulder ignores a stream. She sealed the ceiling with the same mixture, leaving a small vent that she could open or close with a wooden plug. For additional heat on the coldest nights, she built a tiny clay stove, no bigger than a milk pail, vented through a flue that ran horizontally along the back wall before exiting through the foundation. The horizontal run was deliberate. Peter had sketched it in his journal. A horizontal flue radiates its heat into the wall rather than sending it straight up and out of the chimney. Every degree was captured, stored, remembered by the clay. By the end of the 3rd week of November, Marandar was living in a warm room underground while the first serious cold settled over Garnet like a judgment. The town noticed, not the warmth. They could not have known about that, but the fact that the Danish widow had not died, had not appeared on the road to Silver Plume, had not done what she was supposed to do, which was disappear. She had instead taken up residence in the most wretched building in town, a flooded ruin that smelled of minerals and failure, and she showed no signs of leaving. Silas Whitfield, who ran the general store and served as the nearest thing Garnet had to a mayor, was the first to say it publicly. He said it at the store counter, loud enough for the 3 men buying lamp oil to hear. The doll woman is living in the Lundgren cellar, standing water up to her knees. She has lost her mind with the grief, and when they find her frozen come spring, it will be on the conscience of every man in this town who did not drag her out. He said it with conviction, and he said it with something that might, if you were generous, be called concern. Silas Whitfield was not a cruel man. He had donated a cord of wood to the church last winter, and he extended credit to families who were behind on their accounts. But his generosity operated within a framework that he had never examined, a framework in which the proper response to cold was more wood, thicker walls, bigger fires. The idea that a lone woman in a flooded cellar might know something he did not was simply outside the borders of his map. The laughter was quiet but persistent. It traveled through Garnet the way all small-town judgments travel, through kitchens and porches and the spaces between words. She is digging her own grave. She is making pottery in a swamp. The foreign woman thinks mud is a house. Marin heard none of it. She was underground, and underground was warm. December came like a fist. The temperature dropped to 20 below and stayed there, a malicious plateau that turned breath to ice and made the simple act of walking to the outhouse a calculated risk. The first blizzard arrived on December 11th and did not relent for 3 days. Snow piled against the north walls of every cabin in town. The wind found every gap, every poorly chinked joint, every place where the builder had trusted wood to do what wood cannot do, which is stop moving air. The cabins of Garnet were well built by the standards of the territory. But the standards of the territory were designed for ordinary winters, and this winter was not ordinary. By Christmas, 4 households had burned through more than half their wood supply. The creek froze solid, eliminating the easy water source. 2 families doubled up in the largest cabin, pooling resources. Silas Whitfield's own fine house, the pride of Main Street, developed a crack in the north wall that whistled like a tea kettle when the wind blew and let in a draft that no amount of rags or tar could stop. And underground, in the flooded cellar of the ruined Lundgren assay office, Marin Dowell sat on a bench she had built from salvaged pine and read her husband's journal by the light of a single tallow candle. The air around her was 58 degrees. The clay stove was burning 1/4 of a split log, a piece of wood no bigger than her forearm, and the horizontal flue was feeding its modest heat into the cob wall, which absorbed it and held it and gave it back in slow, even waves. The spring burbled quietly beneath her stone floor, an engine of warmth that required no fuel and would never run dry. She was not comfortable in the way that comfort is usually meant. The ceiling was low. The room smelled of damp clay and tallow and the faint sulfur of the mineral spring. Her world was small and dim and underground, but she was alive and she was warm, and the blizzard above her was someone else's problem. January was worse. January was the month that broke Garnet. The cold deepened beyond what anyone had prepared for. Pipes burst. Livestock froze in their pens. The wood pile behind the church, which served as a communal reserve, dwindled to a height that could be measured in days rather than weeks. Old Ansel Breck, who lived alone at the north end of town, was found in his cabin on the morning of January 14th, frozen in his chair with his hands still wrapped around a coffee cup. The coffee was a solid brown disk of ice. The fire in his stove had gone out sometime in the night, and the cold had come in and taken him as quietly as a thief. That was the morning Silas Whitfield came to the cellar. He came alone. He came without announcement. He stood at the top of the cellar stairs and called down into the dark, his voice rougher than he intended, stripped of its usual mercantile confidence. "Mrs. Dowell, but are you alive down there?" The answer came from below, calm and clear, slightly echoed by the stone walls. "I am, Mr. Whitfield. Come down if you like. Mind the 4th step. It is slick." He descended. He had to duck under the salvaged timber that framed the ceiling. The air changed as he went down, warming with each step in a way that his body registered before his mind could process. By the time he reached the bottom and stood in the small clay-walled room, lit by a single candle and heated by a stove no bigger than a butter churn, he was sweating under his coat. He stood there for a long time. He looked at the stone floor. He looked at the clay walls. He placed his bare hand against the cob and felt the warmth radiating from within it, slow and steady as a heartbeat. He looked at the spring water, channeled neatly along the western wall, steaming faintly in the candlelight. He looked at Maren, who sat on her bench with Peter's journal open on her lap, watching him without accusation. Silas Whitfield was 61 years old. He had built his store with his own hands. He had survived 2 previous winters that men still talked about. He had never, in his entire life, asked a woman to teach him anything. He removed his hat. He turned it in his hands, working the brim the way a man works, a problem he cannot solve. "Ansel Breck is dead," he said. "I am sorry," Maren said. And she was. "The Muller family is burning their furniture. The Kesslers have moved into the church." He paused. The hat went around again. "I told people you had lost your mind." "I know. I was wrong." She said nothing to that. There was nothing to say. Being right is not a conversation. He looked at the walls again, at the small stove, at the flue that ran along the back wall and vanished into the foundation. He could feel the warmth of it through the clay, a warmth that had no right to exist in January. In a cellar, in a ruin. He asked the only question that mattered. "Can you teach us?" Maren closed Peter's journal and set it beside her on the bench. She placed her hand flat on its cover, the way you touch the headstone of someone you loved. "Yes," she said. She taught them. She did not teach with lectures or diagrams, though Peter's journal provided both. She taught the way her father had taught her, by doing. She went into their homes, into their frozen, drafty wood-hungry cabins, and she showed them what the earth already knew. She showed them how to bank soil against their north walls, how to build interior walls of clay and straw that stored heat rather than simply blocking coal. She showed them how to modify their fireplaces with masonry baffles that captured heat before it fled up the chimney. She showed them that the creek, frozen on its surface, still flowed beneath, and that water piped through a cellar could warm a floor. Not everyone listened. Not everyone survived. But those who did emerged from that winter with a different understanding of where they lived, not on the land, but in it. The surface was a fool, just as Peter had written. The answers were below. Spring came in late March, tentative and muddy. The snow pulled back from Garnet like a tide retreating, revealing the damage. 3 cabins had been abandoned. 2 people had died. But the losses were fewer than anyone had predicted, and the reason was a widowed Danish woman who had been evicted into November with nothing but a dead man's journal and a ceramicist's understanding of clay. Maren did not leave the cellar. She improved it. Over the following years, she expanded the underground rooms, added a ventilation system that drew fresh air through a buried pipe warmed by the earth, and cultivated a small garden in the shallow, warm water of the spring pool. She grew watercress and mint. She grew things that had no business growing in the mountains of Colorado, and she did it by understanding that the water was not an enemy to be drained, but a resource to be understood. The water that had drowned her husband became the water that fed her. Gerald Croft returned to Garnet in April of that year on his regular circuit. He found the Lundgren property occupied and improved. He found the woman he had evicted standing in the doorway of what was now, by any reasonable measure, the most functional structure in town. He had the legal right to remove her. He had the paperwork in his satchel. He looked at the paperwork. He looked at Maren. He looked at the 27 signatures on a petition that Silas Whitfield had organized requesting that the county transfer the abandoned Lundgren property to Mrs. Peter Dahl in recognition of services rendered to the community of Garnet. Croft stamped the transfer document and set it on the porch rail, weighted with a stone. He paused at the gate. He adjusted the latch so it closed properly behind him, and he left. Years later, travelers passing through Garnet would remark on the strange, quiet woman who lived beneath the old assay office. They would note the warmth that rose from the ground near her door, the green things growing where green things should not grow, the faint mineral smell that hung in the air like a memory. They would ask how she had come to be there, and the people of Garnet would tell the story the way all small towns tell their origin stories, with pride and a convenient forgetting of the parts where they were wrong. But Maren never corrected them. She would sit in her underground room on winter evenings, the spring murmuring beneath the floor, the clay walls breathing their stored warmth into the still air, and she would open Peter's journal to the last page he had written. It was not a grand statement. It was not a lesson or a philosophy. It was a sketch of the cellar, drawn in cross-section with a single annotation in his careful hand. Maren, the water here is warm. Remember this. She would close the journal. She would place her hand flat on the warm stone floor and feel the pulse of the spring beneath. Steady and patient, the heartbeat of a world that did not care about foreclosures or blizzards or the opinions of men who had never thought to look down. Now, that story ended, but the question it asks has not. You are listening to this, and somewhere in your life there is a flooded cellar. There is a place that everyone has told you is ruined, worthless, a liability. A skill you were told has no market, a relationship you were told to abandon, a part of yourself that the world measured and found unprofitable. What if the water is warm? What if the thing you were taught to drain is the thing that has been keeping you alive all along? What knowledge did someone leave you, written in the margins, spoken over a kitchen table, demonstrated without explanation that you have not yet opened? What journal is sitting on your shelf, waiting for the winter that will make it necessary? The men of Garnet built their walls high and burned their fires hot, and called it wisdom. Merendal went underground and let the earth do the work. One of them ran out of fuel, the other never needed it. Your cellar is waiting, your water is warm. Go down. This story is a historically inspired reconstruction. The characters are fictional, and the events are a dramatization of principles related to survival, shelter, and geothermal science. The content presented here is for entertainment and inspirational purposes only, and does not constitute professional engineering, architectural, or survival advice. Always consult with qualified professionals before undertaking any building or survival-related activities.